You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 82. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my dear friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm so glad you decided to join me this week. I have a wonderful interview with two very special guests, Melanie Goela and Ellen Schlesinger. Ellen and Melanie are both lawyers turned counselors, and they are the founders of From Anxiety to Ease. It is an organization that is dedicated to supporting the mental health and well-being of lawyers, and they focus in particular on anxiety, which I think most of us, especially lawyers, have experienced at some point. And part of their objective is to help create relief from anxiety, to cultivate self-trust, and to expand beyond survival. So you will want to listen to what Ellen and Melanie have to say. It is practical, it is helpful, it is impactful. Before I turn it over to our interview, I wanted to spend a moment to talk about a program that I am offering in January, and I would love for you to consider joining me. I am opening the doors to a program. It will be a 6-month group coaching and mastermind experience where you will have the benefit of being coached and surrounded by community members who can offer their support as well. The way this is going to work is we will have 6 months together. We will have one theme per month. You will bring your goal and we will work our way through it. You will learn tools to not only achieve your goals, but also tools that will help transform you into the person who has achieved those goals. So just to go through some of the topics, we're going to start in January with goal setting. So you bring whatever it is that you want to work on, whether it's a job transition, whether it's better time management in your practice, whether you want more confidence when you're dealing with opposing counsel or others who maybe you find challenging to deal with. You get to decide what the goal is. And once you have set that goal, we get to work in helping you achieve it. So we start out in January with setting the goal, establishing what that looks like, creating the roadmap. In February, we turn to self-concept. So that is all about creating an internal concept of ourselves that matches the external results that we're hoping and seeking to create. In March, month 3, we look at obstacles as roadmaps. So we look at what it is that we think is standing in our way is actually the way. In April, we'll turn to confidence, authority, and power, and we'll learn how to cultivate all of these things, because when you have full confidence, full authority, and full power, you are so much more capable to reach at the edges of your capacity. You'll see what you are truly capable of. In May, we'll focus on boundaries, which of course are required anytime you set out to achieve something, achieve a goal, time management, whatever that happens to be. There's a requirement for you to protect the goal that you are seeking to achieve, and also to protect yourself, to set boundaries internally and externally. And then in June, we'll talk about sustainable growth. I will also be offering 2 additional classes, one on time management and one on career transitions, because these are topics that come up often in my practice. They're topics that I'm passionate about, and I want to offer extra resources to you in case these are topics that resonate with you that you would like some help with. And I think all of us benefit from focusing on time management, and I think all of us can benefit from what I'll be saying and sharing about job transitions. Even if you don't want to leave your organization, even if you don't want to leave the job that you're in, much of what I discuss, much of what is relevant there is applicable to everybody who wants to grow and thrive within their career. So the way this is going to work is we'll have 6 months together. We will have 2 live calls every month. I will be sharing with you questions every month for you to answer to keep you on track, to help you focus on what it is that you want to achieve. And I will also be finding a way to create community among you, whether that's a Facebook group or a group on a different platform. I'd love to facilitate for you a sense of community so that you're not just pursuing your goal on your own. You're pursuing your goal in a container with others who support you, who are there to celebrate your successes as you achieve them, and who are there to help lift you up when things don't go the way that you wanted. So if this is something that is of interest to you, I absolutely encourage you to sign up. If you have any questions about it, please feel free to reach out to me. You can send me an email. You can send me a message on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to discuss it with you. The link to register will be on the show notes that go along with this episode, so you can find it there. If you can't find it, just send me a note and I will send it to you. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention before we turn over to the interview is that I will be hosting a free webinar on Wednesday, December 21st at noon PT, that's Pacific time. The title of the webinar is 6 Steps to Sustainable Success in 2023. So we are going to be talking about what it takes for you to achieve your goals sustainably. And if you're interested in signing up for that webinar, the link to register will also accompany the show notes for today's episode. So if you're interested, please sign up. I would love, love, love to have you there. So with that, my friend, I am going to turn us over to today's interview. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll look forward to reconnecting again with you next time. Bye for now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm so excited to introduce you to today's guests. We have Melanie Goela and Ellen Schlesinger who are joining us. Melanie and Ellen are both lawyers turned counselors and the founders of From Anxiety to Ease. If you're not familiar with From Anxiety to Ease, it is an organization that Melanie and Ellen have created to help support and promote mental health and well-being among lawyers worldwide. And I love what they are doing. I'm going to introduce each of them in just a moment, but I was on their website preparing for today's interview, and I loved their tagline: create relief, cultivate self-trust, expand beyond survival. These are such powerful words and themes, I think, that we're going to explore in today's episode. And so just delighted to have all of you here listening today, and delighted to have Melanie and Ellen. Melanie, Ellen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Yes, thank you, Paula.
Thank you so much for joining. And I'm going to start out by asking each of you to share a little bit about yourself, about your story, your experience as a lawyer, how you transitioned to what you are currently doing. And Melanie, I'm going to start with you. So please tell us about yourself, what you do now, and how you got here.
Yeah. So Paula, as you were saying, Ellen and I run a private therapy practice together, specializing in lawyer mental health. I've been a therapist for almost 16 years now. And prior to our private practice, I worked at Toronto Law School as a therapist for the JD students there. And that really became the bridge to working with lawyers specifically, because before that I was working with trauma survivors, actually nothing to do with lawyers actually at all, for about 5 years when I first became a therapist. And then prior to all that, I was a lawyer myself for a very brief moment in time. I literally got called to the bar and then went to do my master's in counseling psychology and become a therapist, as it was something I was always interested in. And for me, it was always a choice between law and going into psychology. And so having tried law, maybe not for long enough, I'll say that, but having tried it, I just kept having this feeling like I want to at least try out psychology and therapy, and I could always go back to law if I wanted to, but I just felt that urge to do it. And so I did it really soon after and have loved it and not looked back since.
That is such an incredible story, Melanie. I'm so curious because I think it takes so much courage to make a decision fairly early on in your legal career that this is not the right path for you. I would love to know, and I know our listeners would love to know how you knew or how you made that decision to transition into counseling.
Yeah. And so for me, it was a very intuitive decision in the end. In the beginning, it was 4 or 5 years, including pre-law school, tons of thoughts, confusion, just feeling like I was someone who couldn't make a decision because I didn't know what it was that I really wanted to do or that I really loved to do. Now, probably then I didn't realize that there was no perfect answer to that. And I thought there was, and that kept me pretty paralyzed. I also had a family who was steering me towards law. So I'm of a family of two sisters who are also lawyers. I'm the second. And so my older sister was already in that path. And my father just loved it. He just thought it was great. So he was just like, it's the safe bet. It's the bet that gives you so many choices. So choice appealed to me. And for like a lot of other people, we go to law school thinking it's going to open up a lot of doors for us. And I think it does for a lot of people, but it wasn't the doors I wanted opened. And I just realized that trying out a few different things, like I tried poverty law while in law school, and I loved it, but something still didn't feel right. I enjoyed speaking to the clients coming in for service more about their mental health, their happiness, their family, and then the legal was kind of the thing I did on the side, but it was really those conversations I was having with people who were suffering that started to give me a clue that this is how I want to spend my day. I was taking courses in law school that were more mediation, dispute resolution, anything where I could find that people focus and that focus on like development and growth. And so those started to become my clues. Out of safety, I probably completed law school, although I did love it, I have to say. And it didn't kind of make sense to just stop, pause, and do something else, at least not to me. But then once it was all done, I just kept having this feeling like I got to do the thing that, I think I'll love to do. And even if I don't like it, I can at least say I was true to myself. So it was a real intuitive, I think spiritual decision, a bit like a sense of like, there's something bigger here that I want to live my life for. And once again, even if it doesn't pragmatically work out, I could at least say like I'm living on my own terms. So that's how it looked for me.
It's such a beautiful story, Melanie, and I know it resonates with a lot of listeners. And I think that story that you tell as well about kind of your family's expectations and the idea of it being the safe path. And, I think there's a lot of different factors at play when we make those types of decisions, especially when you're first starting out. And what I love in particular is how the two now complement each other. Your experience in law school, working with law students, has set you up perfectly to now do the counseling work that you do with lawyers. And I imagine you still do some work with students as well.
Yes. I mean, students are welcome to our practice. Absolutely. So we have available spots for both law students and lawyers. Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Melanie. And we have Ellen. Ellen, you have also undergone a very interesting journey from lawyer to counselor. Please tell us more about yourself, how you started out and how you got to where you are now.
Well, I grew up in Montreal. And, my mom and my dad were the first in their families to go to university. And so university was just a huge value to them. So it was kind of like, you're going to university no matter what. And for undergrad, I did get into a social work program at McGill, but I thought I'm so young. Because in Montreal, you start university at 19, 18. So I was like, what life experience do I have that can really help people and their problems? And so I ended up going to Concordia in communications, which was a lot of fun because it was writing, it was doing films, videos, sound projects. So it was very creative. But I took a desperate elective to fulfill one of my requirements, and it was political science. And damn it, I had the most amazing teacher who made me think about myself, my community, my province, my country, the world. And I was just hooked into the human experience and then the policies governments create and how it affects people. And so that was the problematic course that led to a minor in political science that then had me apply to law schools. And I only applied to law schools in BC because I wanted an adventure. It was a bit like, what could I do that my parents would approve, but would also give me a sense of freedom and adventure? So I only applied to BC. I was tired of the winters in Quebec, and I got into UBC law. And so I just, like, now looking back, I was like, oh my goodness, just moved across the country, not knowing anyone, and started law school. And like Melanie, I had a lovely experience in law school because I found like a gang of friends who were really lovely and supportive and had a lot of fun with, but I could never quite find my place. Like, it was also back in the day where law schools didn't have a lot in terms of career services or career support. And it really felt like, you know, the larger firms, they come in and they sponsor all these fun events. And it seemed, you know, kind of like the tide was, if you want to be a good lawyer or an accomplished lawyer or a successful lawyer, you are to work at some particular larger firms or national firms. And so while I tried to steer myself away, it was also really hard to find work in social justice law, which I was really interested in because there's not a lot of funding for that. So I ended up articling at a national firm. And similar to some of Melanie's stories, the stuff I found most rewarding was when I was really just helping people in their personal development. So I would get like some, you know, bizarre files for corporate law, because sometimes we'd do like a favor for a client. And we had, you know, a client who had a teenage stepson who kept drinking and driving and getting these convictions. And so I was like thrown to go to, like, at the time, what was it, 222 Main Street in the downtown east side of Vancouver and represent this kid. And the most enjoyable thing about that case was not the court appearances, was not like the plea. It was like figuring out with this young person, like, what are they really passionate about in their life? What do they really want for themselves? And then being like the intermediary between him and his parents to see, you know, like what courses they could fund, what next steps they could do in his personal, professional life that would solve the problem of the alcohol. And so after I articled and got called, I then worked in like law adjacent work. I did historical research for Indigenous land claims, which was interesting because we were independent. So we were funded by the federal government, but we were completely independent, which was lovely. And yeah, I worked with an interdisciplinary team, but there was something still like I miss being with people, not just historical documents, and wanting to see change more in real time. And so I went to a career counselor. And, you know, they suggested, why don't I do some research into counseling psychology and, you know, do some informational interviews with therapists. And so that's what I did. And so it took me longer to get to counseling psychology. But yeah, I eventually did.
It's an amazing story. And it, in some ways, similar to Melanie, it's the law kind of was the starting point, but then you found that the elements of what you were practicing, right? It's that interpersonal relationship. It's figuring out how do we deal with the alcohol and, you know, manage that relationship from the sounds of it between the son and the parents. And that's ultimately what led you to where you are now. I'd love to know, because you and Melanie had quite separate paths. When did you come together to create From Anxiety to Ease?
Well, it was lovely because like Melanie, when I graduated from my master's in counseling psychology, while I did my thesis, I interviewed for my master's thesis women who left the practice of law and their emotional experiences leaving the law. Otherwise, I didn't immediately work with law students or lawyers, and I worked in public mental health, which again, like, was just fantastic in terms of, you know, working with really severe mental illness, working with very severe substance use. So I think those are like really helpful experiences to have as a clinician. And I actually had no idea at the time how helpful they would be when I returned to clients in law schools and the legal community. And then in my network, someone forwarded me just a 9-month term job at Osgoode Hall Law School for a mental health counselor. And it would be covering Melanie's leave. And, being then a Western Canadian, I was like, there's no way I'm going to move to Toronto and live in Toronto. Like, yuck. And friends encouraged me to apply, and I did. And I ended up moving to Toronto in August 2015. And Melanie was so gracious in terms of how she helped me bridge into the job. And she left me her contact information. And she said, if you ever want to connect, here's my info. And so I took her up on that. And then we became friends and colleagues. And Osgoode Hall Law School found some funding to keep me on when Melanie returned. And so then we just had a really strong friendship and collegial relationship that then naturally just progressed into serving the legal community beyond the law school.
That is so wonderful. I love that story. And Ellen and Melanie, what is it that you do now? Because I gather you've helped law students, both of you, in the past, and what you do now seems to encompass counseling, coaching, speaking, and providing programming. And so what is it that you do now? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I would say it's a pretty full service practice that we have. We consider it both a group practice because we have about a handful of therapists who work with us, who provide individual therapy to lawyers who have really come to become specialized in this area as well. So one of the key cornerstones of our work is providing individual therapy. Both Ellen and I still provide individual therapy as well as our team. We provide that also, though, as part of like in-house programming for law firms. And so they'll contract us to do what before COVID was called on-site counseling, where we would come in a few hours a week and they would fund the cost for their lawyers to come see us specifically just with our background. And now has, through the pandemic, turned into virtual counseling, which we have found actually increases access and comfort because they don't have to go into a specific office in their firm to come see us. So we do that. So we do in-house counseling programs. And Ellen and I most recently have started doing like wellness and anxiety coaching for lawyers online. And so the coaching piece is what allows us to move beyond just both of our borders of BC and Ontario and serve lawyers across Canada. And even we started supporting some lawyers in the States as well. So we've just heard that there's just not enough lawyers with that therapy background in each jurisdiction. So, and we do that through online and group coaching programs.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. And Ellen, this next question is for you. And I just wanted to point out, I think your thesis sounds so interesting to be studying the emotional side of women transitioning out of law. I think we could have a whole podcast episode about what you discovered. What I would love to ask you is how things changed for you. Melanie mentioned that with the pandemic, you were able to do more remote counseling, that increased access, that you found more people were feeling comfortable coming to see you. What else did you find changed for you during the pandemic? Maybe in terms of the way you were practicing and also the types of issues that lawyers were bringing to you.
Yeah. So the pandemic, the helpful thing as a mental health clinician for the pandemic is it allowed us and allowed us to work virtually. So we can really work from anywhere. And I had a baby at the beginning of the pandemic. So baby was planned, pandemic wasn't. And so I ended up relocating with baby back to BC from Ontario to be closer to family. And so, I think some of the parallels of what we were dealing with as clinicians and people just living in the pandemic, as we still are, were reflected in our clients in terms of this sudden immersion between work and personal life, also just feeling like really restricted, like, any kind of outlets that helped nurture our spirit seemed suddenly taken away, and physical community and connection was diminished as well. So there was a lot of feeling of isolation and loneliness, particularly with our clients who were perhaps not partnered or didn't have a family. And then those clients who did have partners or families, it was suddenly like you're around them 24/7. And sometimes you're then even tasked with managing your work and also helping your kids with school. Yeah. So it was just a lot of complete overwhelm and I'd say uncertainty.
Yeah, that's exactly what I noticed too among clients, among colleagues, among friends. And I think there are those who experience the pandemic in a very lonely way. And there are those who experience the pandemic in a, oh, wow, there's a lot happening under one roof kind of way. And as you were talking about the school and the kids and the work under one roof, Melanie and I are both nodding our heads, more so for Melanie. In Ontario, the schools were closed, I believe, for most of it. Whereas here in Vancouver, we were able to have access to our schools, which was a lifesaver for everyone in my family, at least. So these are absolutely topics that resonate with the general population and with lawyers, of course. Melanie, your organization, yours and Ellen's organization, focuses on anxiety to ease. And I would love to know what your experience has been dealing with lawyers who have anxiety and what you think some of the common causes might be.
Yeah, so it can be really intertwined and really hard to completely separate out. But what we notice as being like a dominant emphasis on the individual lacking resilience, we would flip to being it's a system that either causes or contributes to or perpetuates anxiety. So yeah, there might be some individual factors, but the truth is we are all programmed through our societies, and the legal profession is just a microcosm of these larger systems we're a part of. And so, the anxiety is from like this feeling of individual responsibility, this feeling of so much pressure and that so much rides on this one person that we can't even make or they can't even make like the most minor of mistake without it feeling like it's catastrophic. And the issue in the legal profession is that it's actually accurate. So in other places, we might have worked with clients to say, of course you're worried about making a mistake, but let's really check and see, is it actually catastrophic? Will there be any consequences? And in the law, we find lawyers can say, yes, there will be. I've been berated for like a misplaced typo. I've been told mixed messages on my performance. I've been told on one hand that I provide really good quality, advice and work. And on the other hand, I need to work on, say, my writing skills. And it just feels really confusing to lawyers. So the fear, I think, of being reprimanded, scolded, and then their reputation being affected. So right then they're not getting like the quote unquote good quality work, and they're seeing that go to other people. It really does feel, and then we really do experience that there's real consequences. So it's hard to just refute with quote unquote, like just rational thinking. It's a hard profession. It's a profession that really holds standards high. And it's not that any of us don't think that like standards are important. Of course they are. The law is important, but it feels like it goes past humane. And so the systemic pressures, I think, are a key part of it. It really makes the individual feel like there's something wrong with them when they're struggling, when they make a mistake to start, but when they're struggling. So with any kind of mental health concerns, anxiety, burnout, it really feels like we've heard our clients, been told, well, okay, yeah, sure, take some time off and really work on your like stress management and coping skills, really work on your resilience skills. And the issue with that is that it looks like they fell short before the leave in that resilience and stress management. And that's not what we find. So I think like there's a stigma. I mean, everyone talks about the stigma, but the stigma here is that like you did something to make yourself feel this way, or you're not doing something or thinking about this properly. It's some sort of character defect or a lack of skills in some way. And I think the profession perpetuates that with its extremely high standards. It's also like a high stress environment. So other people's anxiety will get thrown at you. And so their pressure becomes your pressure, and it gets really convoluted that way. Yeah. So we just think it's like a pressure cooker.
Yeah, there are certainly a number of pressures in a legal practice. And as you pointed out, sometimes small errors can lead to large consequences. And when you carry the weight of that responsibility without having necessarily the right tools or the right support to get you through it, it makes it all the more challenging. And one of the things that I talk about sometimes is that negativity bias. It came up in conversation yesterday where as lawyers, we're often rewarded for seeing the flaws. And so that can spill over into other aspects of our lives. And we can start seeing our own flaws at almost like a heightened level. So the recipe and the petri dish, if you will, creating
Yes.
that opportunity for anxiety is certainly there. Ellen, I'd love to know from your perspective, I understand you have a program that helps lawyers with anxiety, and I'd love to know what inspired you to create it.
Yeah, well, Melanie and I, in starting our business together, continued to then work really closely. And, we would, talk about just like themes we're seeing with clients and how we're working with clients to guide them through. And so probably the number one reason lawyers were accessing our mental health services, the presenting issue was anxiety. Depression, a second, but anxiety for sure, the clear winner. And, as Melanie mentioned, some traditional techniques or perspectives or interventions for anxiety management do not work as well in our experience as therapists with the population of lawyers. And, the example Melanie gave that we often give is, so in cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the strategies is to look at your quote unquote, like irrational thoughts, your distorted thinking, your catastrophic thinking. But when you look at the lawyer in context of their practice, it's not catastrophic, it's not irrational, and so they've often been taught to cross-examine their own thoughts. And then that just like worsens the anxiety. It's just a battle. So how we were working with clients individually, we want to have a larger impact because there's only so many individual clients Melanie or I or our associates can take on. And we want a larger impact in terms of helping lawyers navigate through their anxiety and come to know different truths about their anxiety. The biggest one being, as Melanie spoke about, that having anxiety does not mean they're not resilient. Having anxiety actually means they are resilient because they're experiencing emotion. So yeah, the idea of, we created a group coaching program called The Liberated Lawyer. And we've created a very simple and what we call easy. We're all about working easy, not adding more to someone's plate. We've created a 4-step methodology specifically for lawyers because we know how they are. We've been them ourselves and how they think to take them through. So, a 4-step method that will guide their journey, and then weekly access to both Melanie and myself in a group coaching setting to actually see like, how do we apply the method to day-to-day life, to real life?
Yeah, I love what you're saying, Ellen. I think starting with this idea that, and Melanie touched on this as well, that the lawyers that were coming to see you tended to present with similar challenges, right? Sounds like many, if not most of them, were rooted in anxiety. And you're taking a very narrow group of individuals, right? And creating a program and steps. I love that there's 4 steps, right? There's a methodology, something that you can follow and apply it in different scenarios to help with that anxiety. So I think it sounds really compelling. I love that it's something that you've developed through your experience working with lawyers, because as you pointed out, some of the traditional methods may not work for lawyers in particular. I know when I present on time management, for example, there are some time management strategies and systems that will work really well for non-lawyers. And if you try to apply them in a legal practice, they just don't work. And so it's taking the person and really seeing them in the environment that they're in, and then giving them those practical, usable strategies that won't take up extra time, right? Because who has extra time to, even if the benefit is there, is the time there to make use of it? Melanie, I'd love to hear from you. We're talking about this program. We're talking about it in group. So there's individual counseling. I think we all kind of have a concept of what that's all about. And then there's group programs. And I'd love to hear from you what you think some of the benefits are of doing something like this in a group.
Yeah. And we think specifically for lawyers, there's just not enough like personal, honest conversation about the struggles. There's maybe high level, there's maybe like a speaker series that might occur, but people aren't actually in a space where it feels safe enough to actually say, like, I'm really struggling with my anxiety today. And so this is pretty novel for the profession because it's really hidden behind closed doors. Again, we're talking about it in terms of statistics and research, but we're not talking about it in terms of real human beings who are struggling in a given moment. And so this allows for people to actually be with other lawyers and see, number one, they're not actually alone in this, because as much as we know the statistics, they're so abstract to us, we really feel like we're the exception. Like, oh, those statistics make sense, but like it looks different for other people. For me, it's elevated. And for me, it's something personal that I'm doing or not doing. And when they start to see that those around them, the small group that we're in, also have those misconceptions about themselves. And when they start to see, like when they look at the other participants, they see someone like strong and amazing and talented and competent who happens to struggle with anxiety, not someone who's like weak or lacking resilience. So when they start to see that, I think it gets like, it's like a mirror for them to then consider for themselves, oh, maybe this is true for me as well. We also just find it super pragmatic. Participants will offer each other like little words of support. And that's so nice. Like Ellen and I only have so much wisdom and experience, and we're not practicing lawyers anymore. So the practice does keep evolving. The nuances that they can offer each other are elevated for sure than what we can, right? So like, oh, I said in order to say no to something, I use the language of so-and-so, maybe that would be helpful for you. And so again, we're not having these conversations enough because in the profession, people are trying to hide their struggle because they don't want to be perceived as, not being able to be trusted or relied on. And therefore they're not going to, again, advance their career. So this is a space where there's no stakes, no consequence. It's completely confidential. It feels like it's a really safe, warm space. And we're starting to already see that blossom in like a small way, but a much needed way of that support exchange and that authenticity, like the things people are talking about so openly and honestly is radical for the legal profession.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I myself am part of probably multiple coaching communities at this stage and masterminds and all of it. And I actually, from day one in my coach training, the power of conversation in group is, unless you're in it, it's almost impossible to describe it. But I'm just going to recap some of them because I think they're so important. What you said about not being alone, when you can actually sit in a room and somebody else shares something about anxiety, a challenge that they're having, and you hear that person. And Ellen, you said this, right? Just because you have anxiety doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you, doesn't mean that you're not resilient. And so to hear other people say it and realize, number one, you're not alone. And Melanie, like you said, you may be surrounded by a room full of people who in other environments, you wouldn't necessarily hear these stories, right? As counselors and as coaches, we get to hear what's going on behind the scenes, and some of the most confident seeming people still have challenges. And so you get to see, wow, these people that I respect so much also struggle with anxiety. If they can do it, maybe I can do it too. I think what you said about other lawyers, peers, giving each other some ideas, some supports. Here's some language that I like to use. Here's how I dealt with a difficult situation. All of that is so helpful. And even if what that person is presenting with, right, the fact scenario isn't on all fours with something that you're experiencing, chances are there's something about the story, there's something about the issue that will resonate. And so even if you're not the person who's speaking at the moment, you can learn so much just by being in the room. So I love that you're creating this space, this safe space. And I hope that more lawyers in the future continue to take advantage of these types of groups just because they are powerful. And I think it is hard with lawyers in the legal community. I think there's a lot of, we don't see it, right? We're comparing our insides to other people's outsides. And so this is just a really great forum to allow everyone to come together and to learn from each other. So I love, love, love that. Ellen, this next question is for you, and it's right up there on your website, this idea of cultivating self-trust, which again, I think is such a good, strong theme. And I'd love to know from your perspective, what role self-trust plays and why lawyers seem to lose it, and how and why it's important to build it back.
So self-trust, we think, is the pivotal thing to reconnect with or to rebuild in order to free yourself of anxiety. Self-trust is the antidote to self-doubt. And when we're experiencing anxiety or suffering, especially within the cultural context of legal practice, there's so much doubt We doubt ourselves as people. We doubt ourselves as lawyers. We'll then doubt ourselves as parents, as friends, as you name it. It bleeds into so many different areas of our life. So the idea of, again, reconnecting to this idea that you already are resilient. You already have some strong intuitive abilities of how you might be well or what might make you better, and just even when you have moments when your anxiety lessens, to us, that's evidence of your natural well of wellness that's inside you. And so the self-trust is just to reconnect you with a feeling of confidence that, yeah, I can weather this storm. And this confidence that no matter what the bad weather is, it doesn't say anything bad about me, that I am this beautiful blue sky, this beautiful being, no matter what the emotional weather is.
I love that. And for anybody who's not familiar with the concept of self-trust, I don't think I ever thought about self-trust like when I was practicing law. As a coach, now it's kind of first and foremost. I think we look at our relationships with other people and we treat them all a certain way. And to me, the self-trust piece is having that relationship with yourself and developing that trust with yourself, developing that internal accountability, following through on the promises that you make to yourself. And I think if it's new to you, it can kind of feel a bit weird to be having a relationship, right? We think of relationships as being something that's with a person outside of ourselves, but that, to me, I totally agree, Ellen. I think it is the core. And I love how you described it as the antidote to self-doubt. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And Paula, I realize I didn't quite answer the second part of your question of how do we lose it? So definitely a lot of the systemic pressures have us lose it. There's a lot of expectation that we push through as lawyers, that we push things down, that we may just self-medicate with substances to just get through. There's also, a lack of enough progress and accountability in terms of equity and diversity, and especially around accommodating for any kind of, quote unquote, invisible disabilities, whether it's anxiety, depression, ADHD, law firms, lawyers don't always know whether it's safe to disclose any diagnosis. And I don't know how well law firms are equipped to help create appropriate accommodations.
It's so interesting. And I mean, that in itself is a big, big topic. I like to think that we are on a trend of more openness, of more support, of more understanding. I mean, when I look back, when I started practicing, which was, 2004-ish, that's 16 years, if I'm doing my math correctly. No, 18. My math is not correct. I see such a difference already, and I hope that trend continues. So, and I think the work that you do that helps increase awareness is so important. And Melanie, my next question is for you, and I'm just going to highlight, I think one of the things that you mentioned in our prep call was the idea that in the recent study that was conducted on mental wellness among lawyers in Canada, one of the challenges was that lawyers didn't necessarily know where to go to get help. Am I correct? And you're shaking your head. Yes. So yes. Nodding your head, I should say.
Yes.
And so I think even the fact that we're just creating more awareness of the fact that there is mental illness, that it can happen, that there are challenges that lawyers are all facing at all levels, and that there is support available. I think all of this awareness just opens the door to these conversations and is helping to move us forward in that direction. Melanie, I would love to know from you what you think some actionable strategies are that listeners can apply when they feel anxious.
Yeah, so I think I might just distinguish a little bit between feeling anxious in a moment and if an actionable strategy for when they're finding it to be like a regular experience in their life. And now, of course, they can overlap. But just cutting back to the study for a second, lawyers were saying they didn't know where to go for help. And what would happen then is that they would push through on their own, thinking it will pass, which, yes, it might, but to the point where it worsened and they didn't have that support through the way. So I would first start by just giving that real help-seeking encouragement before anything. So it's never too early to seek help. So this idea that I'll just wait a bit and it'll get better. Yes, it might. And, it's really never too early to seek help. So a lot of clients will come to us and say, I don't know if my problem is big enough. I don't want to waste your time with. And we've never, ever felt that way about a single person who's come to see us. So whether that's a therapist, whether that's speaking to a family doctor, like the key actionable step we would say is to find that container of support, something cohesive and to hold you while you try different things out. That's like the big one, I would say. And
what is you there for 1 second, Melanie?
Sure.
Because it's building the roof on a sunny day instead of waiting for the rain and the leaky roofs and everything like that. So if there's those initial wanting to get more information, develop that support network so that it's there when you need it. You don't have to build it when you're feeling like things are falling apart around you. So sorry to interrupt you, but I just think
I appreciate that.
Starting early is so important. And so thank you. Go on.
No, thank you. So I think help seeking is an actionable step in the profession that's just not like modeled enough. Right. And like people are even afraid to go speak to a mentor or a partner or a supervisor about a struggle, just to say like, I might need a few days off, something like that's really, really hard in the profession. So it's actually a big actionable step in the legal profession to seek help. So that's why I wanted to highlight that one. And then the goal around help seeking would be what we were talking about before, which was to start to internalize that there's not something broken, damaged, or wrong with you, that you're a human being experiencing really normal human experiences that when coupled with the self-judgment turn into what we call, again, a clinical anxiety or a clinical depression, right? But I always say, like when we were little and we felt anxious, if someone said to us that's normal and human and there's nothing wrong with you for feeling anxious, it probably wouldn't turn into a bigger storm or a bigger problem, so to speak. So the actionable strategy is that self-compassion. Sounds like such a big and hard thing to do. We're talking in really simple ways. Anything that conveys to you a sense of self-acceptance, a sense of kindness to yourself. So my favorite is, it's okay that I'm feeling this way. So if I'm nervous, I was a little nervous for the podcast today, Paula, right? So just being really open and authentic again. And so I just said, it's okay. It's totally human and normal to feel nervous about something. And it just lightens the pressure and there's no extra judgment that comes with it. So now the anxiety can kind of like settle a bit and I can see through my resources a bit more, right? I can see I've done this before. I've got this. I can trust myself. I can handle this. It's a safe, kind relationship. So all the insights become so much clearer when they're not blurred by the self-judgment. So really simple. It's okay. This is allowed. This is human. You might take a breath while you do that. You might place your hand on your heart, which sends a message of safety. Those are super actionable steps. And with the help of a therapist or a coach, it just allows you to internalize that more.
That is such a wonderful strategy. And it is so simple and it is so effective, that internal dialogue. And I've used variations of that as well, whether it's for anxiety, like it's okay to be nervous and go ahead and do the thing that scares me, or whether it's time management. This will sometimes come up. I just need to do one thing. It's taking control of that internal narrative, because what it helps to avoid, which I love that you highlighted this, is that extra layer of judgment that you can start piling on top. So if you've got that initial anxious feeling and then you start getting upset about having the anxious feeling and then the self-judgment on top of the anxious feeling and all of it, it snowballs in the worst way. So I think what you've described is just a very simple, gentle way of allowing that feeling to be there and you get to still keep going. So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful tool. Ellen, we have been talking quite a bit about anxiety, and I would love to know, what is one thing that you wish every lawyer knew about anxiety?
That it's treatable. Yeah. That you don't have to suffer as much as you might be suffering right now. And that, and also to go to both points that you made, Paula, and Melanie made, when we talked earlier about lawyers are trained for the negative. So learning a kind self-dialogue, learning to be compassionate towards ourselves is also a learning, and it's a skill. And just as we can learn to spot any deficiencies, we can learn to develop an internal language that's kinder towards ourselves, that's more loving.
I love that. And I mean, I've been really practicing my internal dialogue, and I find that it influences my external dialogue as well. I think when we can find more compassion for ourselves, we're also so much better positioned to find that compassion for other people. And I think, and this is probably true, not within just the legal profession, but in terms of mindsets, I think if we look at how we approach learning and growth today, if I look at how my kids are being taught in schools, there's a lot more emphasis on the social, emotional intelligence of the role, that almost a more positive way of learning is being encouraged versus what I know I experienced when I was in school. It was more of a rote learning. It was more top down. And I think we may have internalized that sort of the former model as being the correct one. And what I've learned through my coaching is that, in fact, that positive, more open approach to learning is sometimes better than that more high pressure, you must sort of shame-based assimilate and do learning, the way that it impacts your nervous system, the way that it influences your creativity. And so I think for us to make that shift, right, to be able to shift the dialogue. If we think that being mean to ourselves is going to get us to go to court and get the order and everything's going to be happy versus, well, what if I'm compassionate with myself in that situation? Will I get the result that I want? Or do I need to be mean to myself in order to get the right result? And I love how Melanie is shaking her head in a no sign. And so we're actually learning. By learning how to manage anxiety, we're actually learning ways that we can be more productive and more effective without necessarily having to resort to some of the strategies that we may have been using that maybe were helpful to get us to this point, but maybe there's other strategies out there that will help you go even further that are gentler in a sense, which may seem counterintuitive. Melanie, I have the same question for you. What is one thing that you wish that every lawyer knew about anxiety?
That it doesn't define them. And I think it's intersecting with what Ellen said, right? It doesn't define them. It doesn't make them who they are. They are so much more than their experience of anxiety. And, they're therefore not subject to this for the rest of their lives. A lot of lawyers come to us thinking, I am a type A person. I'm just anxious. This is who I am. Maybe can you teach me some tools? And I don't think they're actually looking for or thinking real transformation is possible. But honestly, it feels like it overwhelms us so much to experience anxiety, but it's just a tiny piece of who we are or our experience. And as Ellen was saying earlier, we're like the blue sky that holds the weather of anxiety. We're so much more expansive, and lawyers are too. So I wish them to just consider, what if anxiety has nothing to do with who I am? What if I'm so much more than my experience of anxiety? And then coupled with Ellen's words, and therefore it's treatable, therefore it's changeable, therefore some freedom is possible for me.
I love that, Melanie. That's such a great point. It reminds me of some of the early learning I experienced as a parent, where I was learning how to discipline my children, and not discipline in the harsh discipline way, but to teach them. And one of the pieces that really stuck with me is when your child does something wrong, the child is not wrong, but the behavior is wrong. And so you separate the two. And it sounds like you're doing the same. You may have anxiety as a person, but you don't necessarily need to label yourself as an anxious person. And so the way you frame that, in my mind, just separated the person from the anxiety. And I think that's such a great place to start when you're dealing with something, especially if it's really holding you back. So such great insights from both of you. Melanie, Ellen, you've both been such amazing guests. I'm really loving speaking with you today. And I know everyone listening is loving it too. And for anyone who wants to find you, who wants to learn more about the programs that you offer, whether it's your one-to-one counseling, whether it's coaching, whether it's having you into the organization to help their lawyers work with anxiety, where can they find you? Ellen, I'll ask you. Sorry. I realize I'm asking both of you at the same time without being very
It's
clear.
okay.
Ellen, where can we find you?
So an easy place to find us is our business website, which is www.FromAnxietyToEase.com. We also have a business page on LinkedIn, From Anxiety to Ease. And you can find us on Instagram, Anxiety Therapists for Lawyers, with a period in between everything. So anxiety, period, for, period, therapist, period. No, anxiety. No. Now I'm losing it.
Anxiety, period, therapist, period.
And we'll link to all of this in the show notes. So we will find it. It'll be there.
Yeah. So Paula, this has been such an enriching conversation. It has been so enjoyable and so lovely. So thank you for having the courage to create a podcast and creating a space where we can talk about so many different things. I'm just getting the shivers. I really appreciate.
Thank you. I'm getting the goosebumps too. Ellen, thank you for saying that, because I love that we are able to have these conversations. I have found this to be a very enriching conversation. I love that we can have these conversations, that we can talk about these topics, that we can then put it into a podcast and anybody can listen with full anonymity. They can hear for themselves that they're not the only ones. In particular, if they're struggling with anxiety, they now know they are not the only ones. This does not define them. Everything that you've shared is so impactful. And so thank you. I think it's a privilege to be able to do this work. And I love being able to have guests like you, like Melanie, who can come on and talk about these topics that we don't need to talk about behind closed doors. Like, let's make these conversations more available and, in service of the goal that you have, right? It's increasing mental health and well-being of lawyers. Thank you.
Thanks.
Melanie,
you so much,
did you want to say anything before we wrap up? I'm just looking. You're so nice to see you both.
Same as Ellen. Thank you so much for this space and for your courage and for inviting us on. It's been a lovely, fulfilling conversation.
Oh, beautiful. Well, likewise, absolutely. Thank you both. And I admire both of you, your courage, the work that you're doing, and conversation to be continued. So thank you again for joining. Thank you everyone who's tuned in this week. All the information that Ellen shared will be linked to. And yeah, just such a great topic and love it. Anxiety treatable. So if you need help with that, you know where to go. Thank you so much, everybody. And we'll look forward to connecting again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.